So we're going to be using this old hinge plate, and it's beginning to look a little familiar to you by now. But what we're going to try to do is we're going to use some patterns in here. First, linear patterns, linear sketch patterns, and then circular sketch patterns in order to put some additional features into this. And the desire with using patterns is we're going to take existing model geometry and be able to pattern that across our design. So if you look at our other model that we have in here, what we're going to do is we're going to try to get something that looks like this. So right now we have our hinge round here on the left hand side of our hinge plate. And what we want to do with that hinge round is be able to put in these holes. So we're going to have 4 holes altogether. 1, 2, 3, 4. And essentially it's going to be creating what looks like 8 features over here on the left hand side, going between holes and then the hinge round back to a hole again and another hinge round after that. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making a cut here, and then with the linear sketch pattern we're going to take that that square, that rectangle that's going to define this cut here, and pattern it to 1/2 inch all the way down to the end of our hinge plate. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and go to our top plane, and let's go ahead and go normal to that, and we're going to take a look at that. So if we click on the top plane, go over here to our view orientation, let's go ahead and scroll down to the normal button, and we're going to take a look at it here. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and open up existing sketch that we have in here, which is going to be that sketch 1. We're not going to necessarily open it up, but we definitely want to show it. So we're going to right click on that, and we're going to tell it to show, because we're going to borrow some of the sketch geometry in order to put this together. So with that showing, we're going to go to sketch, we're going to go to corner rectangle, we're going to start over here in the corner. We're going to go ahead and start on this surface over here in order to put that together. And escape once if you accidentally put your cursor already down. But right click again and get you right back into that command. So just looking for geometry to sketch from. We're going to go ahead and start with that point over here. Sketch it over here. If we can pick up that, you can see that orange selection of that edge. We're going to go ahead and try to pick that up. And you can see the preview of what we're going to be getting in regard to the sketch relationship, which is going to be a coincident relationship, and we're going to go ahead and use that. So now that we have that in place, we have a coincident relationship over here, coincident relationship in the lower right hand side, 2 verticals and 2 horizontals, and it's almost fully defined. What's not defined over here is the length of that. So we're going to go ahead and put a dimension on that, a smart dimension of a 1/2 inch, so 0.5. And now we're going to go ahead and cut that. So we're going to go to Features, go to Extruded Cut. I'm going to go to Through All. And if we go to the green check mark, you'll notice we still have a little piece in here. So what we had in here is we started from that plane. We did Through All, which went through all down to the bottom. What we really want to do is we want to take that feature and we want to do Through All in 2 directions, both directions. And what that does is it's going to open up our direction number 2 down here when we do that. Let's go to Through All both, and it's going to go ahead and check mark that, and it's going to go Through All on the other side too. So a little bit of time saver. You make one selection here instead of having to come down here and check that box and go to Through All over here too. So you save yourself a few steps. Go to the green check mark, and now we have that in place. So let's go ahead and go to the isometric view and take a look at that from the very top, and we'll go on to the next step. So just before we get into our linear feature pattern, let's go ahead and rename our cut extrude. We're going to call that something a little bit more descriptive and call that our hinge cut. So now we're going to take that hinge cut and we are going to pattern it, just like we did with the linear sketch pattern, up the hinge round. So let's go ahead and turn that model around a little bit and take a look at this and see if we can apply that. First thing you want to do is go up to your Feature tab. Go over here to Linear Pattern. We're going to go ahead and click on this, and this is just going to be a quick tour. So I can just show you some of the basics because there is a lot in here, and we don't necessarily need to go through all of this right now. So we're going to save that a lot of that detail for another video. But essentially, from the very top, it's asking for a direction. So just like we did before, you want to click on an edge. It's going to help define that. We know that this edge, since it's already involved in that feature, we're going to go ahead and click on this edge rather than another edge. If that other edge were to disappear or get modeled out of the model, then we're not going to be able to select that. So we're going to select something that's probably pretty close to what we're going to be modifying. So we're going to select that edge, and we have a couple different choices here, spacing and instances. So for instance, we could put a spacing in there. We know the spacing is going to be 1. There's going to be 1 full cycle between a cut and a hinge and then back to the cut again. So we're going to type in 1 there. If we click off of the modeling area, that'll kind of clear that. And then we're going to have 4 instances altogether. We're not going to do a direction tool, although we're going to demonstrate that here in just a minute so we can see kind of a checkerboard as this thing goes across our item, because we don't necessarily have to stay with in a linear direction as it implies. It could be kind of a matrix, so in a way it's kind of a, if you think about it, maybe populating a feature within an area. It could be linear, but it could also expand across an area too. So if we do that, we're not going to go to direction 2 again, so we're going to keep that the same. And you'll notice down here for the instance, it's just going to be 1. It's always going to have a direction 2 in here, but if we just have an instance of 1 in here, it's not going to worry about that. We can't uncheck that and have that go away. So keep that as it is. Features and faces, a couple of different ways we could do this. We could select it within the modeling area and just select like a face that might define what that cut was. That's going to be unique to that cut, so this face would work, but that face wouldn't. This face would work, but again, that face wouldn't either. So we can select it that way. It's going to put in that face in there, and it's going to borrow everything that's associated with that feature. Then if we go to the green check mark, now we have that in place. So real quick, just to show you a different option, if we right-click and go back to the RLP pattern, instead of going to that hinge cut, it did choose that actual name for that feature. So when we chose that face, it actually chose that feature. But we can go to the feature flyout and do the same thing. We can go down here to the hinge cut, select that, and then go to the green check mark. Okay, now that we have a linear pattern the way we like it, we're going to go ahead and break this. We're going to look at some other options on linear pattern from the top to the bottom and kind of look through some of these. We're not going to look through all of them because we don't have a whole lot of time, but some of the basic ones in here I'd like to show you and show you what they might do. So if you start from the top, we chose our edge. We're going to go ahead and keep that. We did spacing in instances, but let's go ahead and do up to reference instead. So if we do that, click on that radio button. These 2 items over here, the distance and the instances, are going to disappear. At least some of those are going to disappear for now, get moved down. But for reference, we're going to go ahead and choose this surface up here. So if you think about what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking that cut, we're going to go up to that surface, we're going to put in so many elements in here. So first thing it asks for down here is an offset. I'm taking my cursor and just resting it over that input box over here, that selection box. And if we type in like maybe 2 inches in here out of a 4-inch block, if you do that, what it's going to do is it's going to, oops, not 4 inches, we want 2 inches. It's going to ignore the first 2 inches of that 4-inch block. So if we did 1, it's going to ignore that top one up here, and it's not going to give us what we're looking for. But that's what that offset does. So we're going to change that back to 0. Now we're going to go ahead and move down a little bit. We're going to continue to use Centroid in here. And now we're going to do our cut. And so our cut's going to be, our cycle is going to be 1 inch. Our cut's going to be a 1/2 inch. So if you do the distance down here of 1 inch and go to the green check mark, still gives us what we're looking for down here. So that's yet another way of doing the very same thing. So again, we chose that edge, no offset over here. We did the centroid of that cut, right in the middle of that cut. And then we're going to go off at a distance of 1 inch. So while we're here, let's go ahead and take that bottom choice and change that. So a number of instances is another way of doing that. So we're going to take the center of that cut, and we're going to provide 4 instances in here. So this gives us something that's just a little bit different. What we're going to do is what SolidWorks is going to do is going to take the centroid of that cut, the very center of that cut, kind of like a mid-plane extrusion, put it up here, extrude it back and forth, put it up here, back and forth, up and down, and then up here it's going to do down and then up, but the up is cutting into a void, so we're going to get something that isn't quite right. So if you go to the green check mark, and maybe this is something you might like to do, but what we have in here is a 1/2 inch cut here, 1/2 inch cut here, a 1/2 inch cut here, then only a 1/4 inch cut over here. So these items inside of this are going to be a little bit longer. So let's see what those are. If we go up to measure and go ahead and click on some of these faces in here, that face of that hinge around and that one too, it's actually 3/4 inch. So what it's doing is it's taking the centroid of this cut, putting it here, cutting it top to bottom, putting it here, top to bottom, or left to right, or back to front. Then up here it's doing the same thing off of that surface, and of course the cut up here is not going to matter, and it's going to take whatever value that's left in that for the distance that it needs to allocate between these 3 hinge rounds. It's going to divide that by 3. and give us so it comes out to 3/4 of an inch. Not quite what we're looking for there, but it kind of shows you what it's thinking there if we want to use that. So another thing to do is go to, we did our instances in here, but we can go to selected reference and maybe provide a different reference in here. So if you select on selected reference and maybe chose this face of the cut, now it's going to do something a little bit different, same as what we had before. Now we're going to ignore this because it hasn't really updated yet, but this dialog box in here that we can make changes to is going to change with it. So now what it's doing is it's going to take that cut surface in here, go up here, you can see the preview of it, it's going to cut it going down, and then, get out of here. This one we're going to cut it off that surface and come down, and at the very top surface up here, the surface we selected up here for the direction, it's going to cut from that one down too. So if we go to the green check mark, now we have what we want. And it should be the distance, it should be 1 inch between that surface and the other surface up there too. So go to measure, just to double check that. Let's click this surface on that hinge round and that surface. And now it's 3/4 of an inch, not 3/4, but 2/3 of an inch. So what happened there? So what it's doing is it's putting in 1, 2, 3, 4 cuts, but only 3 hinge rounds. So it's making a pattern of those cuts. But by doing it, it puts into 4 cuts, but only 3 hinge rounds. So it's now right down the middle of our part. It should be symmetrical. So let's go back into that and see what that looks like. So we did select a reference, did 4 cuts, but now it only has 3 hinge rounds. So a little bit different way of doing it. But those are some of the choices that you have. And if you go to the green check mark, it's going to go ahead and rebuild that. Okay, so now this is broken, and you know what we just did is we put in these 4 cuts. Instead of giving us 4 hinge rounds, now we have 3 hinge rounds right in the middle of the thing. So, you know, that might be something you'd like to do. But let's go back in our linear pattern and let's go ahead and break this some more. Let's go back to our original feature and maybe go to some of the different options that are in this Properties Manager. So if we go to Spacing and Instances, it's remembered the spacing up here that we had before. We're going to go ahead, and if we keep that spacing, let's see what we do. So it actually keeps that. So if we go right back to linear pattern and do spacing instances, we actually want to make that 1 inch. Again, we're going to bring that cut in from the top and actually make 4 of those elements in there. So now we have 4 cuts. We also have 4 hinge rounds in there too. So again, back to linear pattern. A little bit simpler this time. We're going to move down. Bodies. If we were to go in here and maybe select different bodies, we could do that. If you remember the original hinge round in here, that was a separate body. So when you're doing a separate body here, you can't really choose features. At least it's not as easy. It doesn't always work that way, but bodies will work too. So if we had separate bodies we wanted to choose around this model, that is a separate cylinder. We can do a linear pattern with that if we wanted to do that. So that's what bodies do. Instances to skip, kind of like with the linear sketch pattern. We have the capacity to do that too. So actually, let's go ahead and rebuild this. So we don't want to do bodies, we want to do features. So let's go back and re-choose that. So now you can see the preview of what we're going to be getting. So instances to skip. If you were to click inside of that, now we have those magenta or red balls that we have in here. If we click on those, the magenta balls actually turn yellow for the instances we want to skip. So now we're going to skip the second instance, keep the third, but skip the fourth. Go to the green check mark. Now you can see what we're going to get with that. So we're going to go ahead and delete these. We can go back into our modeling area and actually reselect that yellow button in there and get that magenta button back in, that magenta sphere or round or circle, whatever that might be. That's going to give us a preview of what we're going to be getting, back to where we were before. Options. Geometry pattern is just a different way mathematically that SolidWorks will solve it. So if it doesn't quite work one way, you might consider geometry pattern as a way to try to make that work. Propagate Visual Properties. Let's go ahead and do this real quick with our cut in here that we have. Right now we have everything is pretty much homogeneous, but we can take that right click, or if we right click on that surface over here, and this is a real quick side here, but we're going to go ahead and talk about visual properties here in a different video. But if we were to change that and maybe make that hinge cut up here, and we're just going to go back to gray instead of the brass color and go to the green check mark, So what it is, I just right-clicked on something that's endemic of that cut. I went up here to Appearances by right-clicking on that, and we just chose gray to be that hinge cut. So now that feature has got that gray color to it. If we were to go back to the linear pattern and make that change over here in regard to propagating visual properties, you'll notice that it isn't being propagated right now. If we were to right-click on that and go to Propagate Visual Properties, if we go to the green check mark, now it's going to have that. So we had to make that change first and then update that. So that's another option here for her to right-click back into linear pattern, and we can do the full preview, partial preview. We did instances to skip, instances to vary. We can click inside of this. It's a little bit more complicated, but for each one of these instances that we have in here with that magenta ball or button, if we were to click on that, we can go ahead and make a modification to that instance, that one instance only. So right now the spacing is 1 inch. We can make that one maybe 3/4 of an inch, and we could do that for each one of these in here. So not going to spend a lot of time in here. We're going to cover that in a different video with a lot more modifications, but just like with instances to skip, it gives us the coordinates of the different instances that we have in here that are being modified, and then individually they can be they'll show up in the modeling area, and we can make modifications to it there too. So if we go to the green check mark, now you can see that. If we were to click inside of this, we can actually change some of these values in here, or go back into our pattern and actually make our changes in there too. So one thing else I want to show you here before we leave this, let's go ahead and go to the green check mark, and then we're going to come right back to this. So we almost have this really broken, and we're going to make it even more broken here. If we were to go back to our linear pattern and check one more option here I'd like to show you. We've done everything in a linear way along, it's called a linear feature pattern, but we could actually make a matrix out of this and kind of populate a pattern about an area rather than just along a line. We could do that too, and what we want to do is go down here to direction 2 and open that guy up and make modifications to that. So with direction 2, we can define yet another edge, and we can go off in a different direction. You notice that we have an arrow down here too. We can change the direction. We didn't talk about that last time. It's a little bit obscure. Can't really zoom in on it, but you can see that arrow down here. You can change direction, or go up here too with our direction and maybe change the direction over here too. That button that's right next to the edge that we're making the selection for. So the distance here, maybe half an inch. And then instances, remember, is just going to keep that one instance and keep that linear unless we type in a value that's more than 1. So if you do like maybe 4, you can see what that pattern is going to look like. Maybe 7, take it all the way to the end. And maybe half inch is probably a little bit too close, maybe 3/4 of an inch, see what that looks like. So now you can see what that looks like. So it's taking that original pattern, kind of ignoring the modification we made down here, and it's putting it up there. So these boxes kind of start getting in the way after a while. If you want to minimize them, you can do that too. And for each one of these elements in here, if you want to make a change to that, if you go into that and modify the instance, you can do it there too, and it brings up yet another dialog box you can play around with. So once you do that, if you go to the green check mark, it's going to propagate the visual properties. So you have that gray cut in there, and it goes across our model, and that's kind of what it looks like. So now that our model is like completely broken here, I'm going to challenge you to put that into an assembly. So we got this really broken, but let's go back to what we had before, what we really want, and stop goofing off here. Let's go ahead and start by going to that linear pattern. Let's call that our hinge cut pattern instead, something that's a little bit more descriptive. So we're going to call that hinge cut, and then pattern. If we were to right click inside of that, let's go back to the settings that we really want. So if we start from the top and work our way down, we chose that edge over here, spacing instances as opposed to up to reference. Either of those will work. You have a little bit more flexibility with up to reference. You get a little bit more exotic designs by doing that, depending on what you need. But our distance between the cycle over here, between a half-inch cut and a half-inch area, or linear distance that we're going to allocate to the hinge round, we're going to make that 1 inch, so that's going to be good. Direction number 2, if we want to get rid of that, just go down here to a single instance of that. So it doesn't matter what values we put in here, it's always going to be parked down here with 1 instance, and it's not really going to change anything there. So can't put 0 in there. If you try to do that, it's going to revert back to 1, so it's going to at least look for 1. Pattern seed only. That's a different option in here too for direction number 2. We're going to cover that in another video, but essentially what it does is it takes the base pattern here and then propagates it out into your area. But we'll talk about that later. The features and faces, we're going to go ahead and keep that. Propagate Visual Properties, we're going to keep that too, but we're going to go ahead and change that color of that cut. I'll show you how to do that. And the instances of area, we're just going to unclick that. So we're going to get back to where we were before. If you go to the green check mark, now you can see what we have. So let's go up here and let's go ahead and look at our colors. If you click up here, slowly rest your mouse up here, it kind of shows you what you have in here. This is our display pane. And if you go over here to the right one under appearances, again we're going to cover this in a visual appearances video in another video, so look for that. What we have up here is a simple brass color, polished brass for our part that we have in here. We have an aberration down here with a gray color over here for our hinge cut. If we were just to right click on that, we could just remove that appearance. And once we do that, we'd have to rebuild that. If that doesn't work, the Propagate Visual Properties, we're going to have to go back into our hinge cut pattern, edit that, and then go back to the green check mark without changing anything, and it's going to propagate those patterns. So there you have it, a short tour of the linear feature pattern where we took the original hinge cut and propagated it along the hinge round.